listen to this sound. This is a 220 hertz wave. In music, we would call this A below middle C. And now listen to this sound. That is a 220 hertz wave. In music, we would call that A below middle C. Now, it might seem very confusing to think, why is it that those two sound waves, they're the same frequency, they're the same amplitude. How is it that they sound so incredibly different? Now, this title of this video might feel like a spoiler. You think, well, I know what it is. The first one's a sine wave, the second one's a square wave. A square wave, I don't know, some kind of square sound wave, I guess. So let me ask you this. Have you ever been to the beach and waded out past the surf where the waves are just these nice, smooth, kind of rolling things? Now, have you ever seen a square ocean wave just cruise on past? You know, vertical walls, sharp corners, and a nice flat top. I certainly haven't, because that is not a thing. And it's not a thing in the ocean, and it's not a thing in the air either. A sound wave can't be a square wave because it makes as much sense as a square ocean wave. We talk about square waves all the time, especially if you've played around with synthesizers or gotten into that whole world. So it means something. There's something happening there. And it's not that I'm particularly interested in square waves. It's that if we talk about square waves, it unravels some of the very, very fundamental concepts of how sound waves relate to each other. And from there, we can continue to work our way into a very foundational, and I hope very solid understanding of music theory. Let's briefly talk about how you would make a sine wave. That's the simpler one. So let's say that this field of dots is a bunch of air molecules. Remember that sound waves are just compression waves that propagate through the air, or at least the ones that you hear propagate through the air. Let's say we have a speaker. And let's say that that speaker is pulled all the way back at the back of its travel. So at this moment, it's not moving yet, it's not pushing on the air, and it's not creating any kind of sound wave just yet. So we take that speaker and we start to accelerate it, start to push it forward. So it moves forward just a tiny bit. It's not moving very fast yet because it's having to come from a dead stop. It hasn't really accelerated. And that means that it's going to push on the air, but just a little bit. So it creates a little bit of compression. Now, even though it's not much, that compression is still going to travel through the air at the speed of sound, somewhere around 750-ish miles an hour. So it's almost like it flies off the speaker cone and it's moving through the air. So if we fast forward a few moments, let's say that little bit of compression winds up somewhere over here. So the air molecules are a little tighter. Now the speaker continues to accelerate, so it's moving a little bit faster. So it's pushing on that air a little bit harder. So that next little band of sound wave, higher compression, it's following right behind the one we just saw. So the air is a little bit more compressed. And that speaker keeps accelerating, so it's pushing harder and harder. The air is getting more and more compressed until that speaker hits the midpoint of its travel. So if it took the speaker, this long to get to the middle of its travel, accelerating the whole way, it's going to have to start decelerating after that point. Because if it took it that long to get up to full speed, it's going to also take it that much longer to bring it back down to a stop at the end of its travel. So what will happen with the sound wave is it will continue to build up until it gets to this highest pressure section of the compression wave, and then it starts to fall off. So it does exactly the opposite of what it just did. It kind of ramps down back until the air is back to neutral. So the speaker's now at the front of its travel. It reverses and it begins to travel in the opposite direction. And so it does what it just did, but this time backwards, which means it's kind of pulling on the air, creating a low pressure zone. Not very much at first, but that'll get to be more and more. And by the time it reaches that middle point again, that's the lowest pressure part of the wave. And then it begins to slow down and come back to a rest from where we started. So that would look sort of like this, where the air is more sparse. So we get this low pressure zone and then it kind of ramps back up. So if we were to graph this out, and just as a reminder, sound waves are these longitudinal compression waves that travel through air. What I'm drawing right now is just a graph. It is not actually what sound waves look like. But figure if we were to plot it out, the air pressure starts at neutral, it ramps up, gets higher and higher until that high pressure part of the wave, and then it tapers off, comes back down, back to neutral, and then it drops lower as we get into the rarefaction or the low pressure zone, and then it comes back to neutral. So that's our sine wave. Fine. We all get sine waves. That's not the interesting part. What about this square wave? So if we were to draw the graph of a square wave, and this is why we would call it a square wave, the pressure would start at 0, and it would instantly ramp up to maximum. And then it would stay there at constant pressure, just like that. And then it would instantly go down into low pressure, and then it would stay at that low pressure, and then it would instantly ramp back up again, and you would get this repeating pattern of high pressure, low pressure, high pressure, low pressure. None of this gentle ramping up and coming back down. Okay, what's the problem with this? Well, imagine that we tried to make our speaker create this square wave. So the speaker's all the way back again. It's at the beginning of its travel, and we would have to tell it to instantly, in exactly 0 seconds, reach full speed and maintain that full speed as it moves forward until it comes to the end of its travel, and then it would instantly have to reverse and maintain full speed going backwards. If you have any familiarity with anything physical, you know that that is not possible. You can't put your car from 80 miles an hour going forwards to 80 miles an hour in reverse in 0 seconds, and you can't do that to a speaker either. So what would happen if we tried to make a speaker do this? Let's say that the speaker's back here, we tell it to instantly start moving. That speaker would lag behind because it has mass, it has momentum, it has to accelerate to catch up. So it would begin moving forward, it would have to build up speed, and it would wind up having to go too fast because it has to catch up to where it's supposed to be. It would overshoot a little bit and then have to slow back down, and then it would kind of fall a little bit behind and then have to speed back up again. And then when it came to the end of the travel, it would try to stop, but it couldn't quite because it has momentum. So it would shoot over a little bit, and then it would have to pull itself back. It would overshoot a little bit and then come back. And it would do this sort of wobbly approximation of this square wave that we're trying to tell it to do. So, okay, a speaker can't replicate this shape, but just imagine that it could. Imagine that we have some kind of magical speaker that can instantly accelerate and all that. Well, even if it could, air can't do this either. Air cannot go from normal pressure to instantly compressed and then instantly low pressure and then instantly back. It can't do that any more than an ocean wave can, create this perfectly rectangular shape. In fact, the only shape that air can really take, or the only shape that sound can take as it travels through air, is a sine wave. Now, it could be a long sine wave with a long frequency. It could be really short. It could have a high amplitude. But one way or another, it's going to be a sine wave. It can't have some goofy shape like this. So when you hear that square wave, what is it that you're actually hearing? So let's try and create something like a square wave. All we have to work with are sine waves, because that's all that can travel through air. But let's see where we can get to. So we take a speaker, and we make that same 220 hertz sine wave again. Now I'm just going to draw the graphical representation of this. Now let's say we take another speaker. Now this one, just for fun, we have it do that same 220 hertz wave, but we do it in the opposite direction. So as this first speaker is creating the compression part of the wave, this one is creating the rarefaction, the low pressure, and then exactly opposite to this one, it rises, and then it drops. Like that. So what would happen if you listen to this? So we're over here, and these two sound waves together hit your eardrum. The rising pressure from this wave would be exactly countered by the dropping pressure from this wave, and the same thing would happen at every point along this wavelength, and what you would hear is nothing, which is kind of neat. And fun fact, this is actually how sound canceling headphones like this work. They're called sound canceling or noise canceling, because this is literally what they do. They have a microphone on the outside that listens to the ambient sounds, and it plays back the inverse of the sound waves that are hitting the outside of the earphones. Okay, so that's an interesting thing, but it doesn't help us make a square wave. So again, we have two speakers. This one is making our 220 hertz A. This one, this time, let's say it makes a 660 hertz wave. That is exactly 3 times as fast as this wave. So what that means is that this wave is going to rise, it's going to fall, it's going to rise again, and do this in exactly the same amount of time it takes this wave to do just the compression phase. And then it'll continue. So during the rarefaction of this wave, it's going to dip down, come back, dip down, then it kind of meets up at the end. Both of these get to neutral pressure right here. So there, and then like at the end, at the very start. Okay. So what this means, if you imagine a person over here listening to it, these two waves are hitting this eardrum at the same time. This person will experience the pressure from both of these waves simultaneously. So you're effectively adding them together. And for now, let's kind of ignore the latter part of the wave. We'll just talk about the compression part. But what that's going to mean is that as this wave is rising in pressure, so is this one. So if we're adding them together, that means that the pressure that this person is experiencing, I'll draw it over here, I guess. The pressure is going to rise very steeply. Both waves are contributing to this very steep rise in pressure. But then this wave is going to reach its peak pretty quick because it has a faster wavelength or shorter wavelength. And so we get this sort of fall off where this wave is beginning to drop. This wave is still rising, but fairly gently. And so we wind up with this kind of valley in the middle. There's a little high point here, but then this wave drops low while this wave is hitting its peak. So we wind up with something kind of like this. And then as this wave starts to kick back in, it brings the pressure back up. So we get this little hump, and then both waves begin to fall off. And so we get this very steep fall off. So what we wind up with is effectively an M shape. This is the compression part of these two waves added together. And then if we were to look at the rarefaction part, like the latter half of this wave and this wave here, we would get the same thing but in the opposite direction. So it would drop down into the low pressure. We get this kind of funny, I guess, W shape in this case. And then it would come back like that. So these two together would add up to something like this. So here's what this would sound like. Now, I know this is a little bit overwhelming to look at. If anyone is interested, this is a website called wavepot.com. It's super cool, especially if you have even a little bit of inclination towards programming, but it lets you programmatically create sounds. I'm not going to explain anything about the code because if I start explaining that, I won't be able to stop and this will turn into a code lesson. But here is that, here's that sine wave. Okay, so this is this wave here. Here it is with that other wave added in. And you can actually, in the top right here, you can see this little image of the waveform, which is reasonably close to what I was trying to draw. Okay, so that shape, this shape, is this wave and this wave played at the same time. Now, if you listen to this, you can almost kind of flip your mind between perceiving it in these two different ways. On the one hand, it sounds like just a wave, like a unique sound. On the other hand, especially hearing them added together, you can perceive it as if there are these two different frequencies being played together. It is a harmony. But this is what's happening. You are not actually hearing two different, well, I guess it's almost a philosophical debate what you're perceiving. Your eardrum can only either move or not. You don't have two that operate independently to pick up this sound or this frequency and then this frequency, it is doing something like this. It is moving up, or it's moving in, I guess, and then it's kind of moving back, and then this big movement down to this part. Your eardrum is tracking this type of shape. And your brain is, if you're thinking about it right, perceiving two different sounds here. So if we took a third speaker and we played a wave that was 1,100 hertz, that is exactly 5 times as fast as this. And this is a little tough to draw, but we would get something kind of like that. And if we added that into the mix, we now have 3 waves that are all rising in pressure at the same time. So we get an even steeper rise up to the peak. This peak is still high, but it gets flattened a little bit faster because this wave begins to drop before this wave does. So we get a little bit less of that M shape. And then this wave starts to add some positive pressure right in the middle, whereas this one is adding low pressure. So we get this kind of bump in the middle, and then we get another little thing at the end, and then this very steep drop off in pressure because all 3 waves are dropping back down to neutral. And then, we get the opposite of that. Is that right? In the reverse, whatever, something like that. So I would call this a Batman wave if I got to name it, but this would sound like this. And at this point, you're hearing all 3 of these frequencies played together. It's adding up to the Batman wave. Now you'll notice that these 3 waves have something very particular in common, which is that they are exactly integer multiples of each other. This second wave is exactly 3 times as fast. If it were 2.95 times as fast, this wouldn't actually work. They would kind of line up for a wavelength or 2, but then this one would be going a little bit too slow, and so it would get sort of off, and we would no longer get this nice M shape. It would start to get weird and then nonsensical, and it wouldn't create this repeating wave pattern that you're hearing right now. This one is exactly 5 times as fast as the original one, and because it is exactly 5 times, it intersects in exactly the same spots. They add up to this same wave shape together. Now, this is one of the most fundamental aspects of all of music, is this whole number relationship between different frequencies. And we'll talk soon about all the implications of that. But for now, recognize how powerful this relationship can be in creating these new wave shapes out of just sine waves. You can think of sine waves like the building blocks of all of sound, and the way you combine them adds up to everything you hear. Now, I won't continue to draw this, but we can keep doing this same pattern. We can take this fundamental frequency, we add in our harmonic that is 3 times as fast, and then we add one that is 5 times as fast, and we take the summed up wave and we get a little bit closer to the square wave. We would then add one that is 7 times as fast, the 7th harmonic, and then the 9th harmonic, and then the 11th, and we would keep adding in these odd harmonics, and they would get closer and closer, never 100%, but they would get closer and closer to a square wave. So we would wind up with this super sharp rise, and then this really quick little kind of oscillation, and then it would come back, and then a super sharp drop, and we would get something kind of like that. So I'm sure you want to hear this. I will start by just playing the fundamental tone, which is just that sine wave, and I'll just keep adding in these harmonics up until whatever feels right, and just listen to the sound of the resulting wave. It is kind of weird how it is at the same time this very unique sound that kind of sounds like its own thing, and then it's also this harmony of all these different little sine waves that are just getting added together. So here it is, starting from the sine wave and then on up. Okay, and we made it up to the 31st harmonic. Kind of cool, right? Okay, so what is the takeaway here? There's a few very fundamental concepts that I want to get across. First, sound waves are sine waves when they are traveling through the air. Fundamentally, it can always be broken down to a simple sine wave. But you can take different sine waves and add them together, and the way they interact can wind up with, well, it explains every sound you ever heard is a bunch of different sine waves interacting in unique ways. There is this incredibly important fundamental relationship between sound waves that have frequencies that are exact whole number multiples of each other. We have this fundamental wave, the 220 hertz wave, and then we have the wave that is 3 times faster, exactly 3 times faster, and the wave that is 5 times faster. I threw out the term harmonic. That's what that means, but we'll talk much more about that very soon. And for our purposes of trying to create this square wave, we only looked at odd numbered harmonics. So the fundamental, the third harmonic, the fifth, but of course there's even number harmonics. You can have a wave that's twice as fast, and that interacts in other interesting ways. In fact, all of music theory, at least the harmonic component of it, pitches and whatnot, all of that comes from this relationship between different sound waves. It gets complex, but this is where it all starts. So we are headed towards more traditional music theory, the staves and whole notes and things like that. But the more I've thought about it, the more I think we really just need to spend some time talking about the physics of it, because you can't really understand music theory without understanding some of the underlying physical things that are happening. And I think once you do, all of that stuff starts to get a whole lot simpler. So thanks a lot. I hope this made sense. I'll see you next time.